Today we are going to have Nelis on board. So we had a nice conversation about experiences on a LinkedIn post in the past related to Conways Law, code ownership, organizational structures. And Nelis had quite some nice experiences in that domain, where we concluded, let's have a video call and conversation and try to pick his brains on that subject as a non-role person, but maybe still technical agile coach. He has quite some experiences with working inside teams that are relevant to the subject. Nelis, up to you. So maybe first introduce you. Where did you come from? What do you actually do day to day? And then maybe share some experiences related to Conways Law and code ownership. Maybe what did you thought about it in the past, and how did it evolve during your career working inside teams and with software?
Okay, so maybe where do I come from? I've always been interested in working in teams and improving software. And I've done a little bit, most of the roles that are needed to develop software. I worked a bit as developer, as architect, as analyst. I never really worked as testers, but I've been really busy with testing. I worked as Scrum Master, Agile coaching, and now I really try to focus on improving the technical way of working as a way to improve the culture and the whole way of working. And in that perspective, I'm often involved with shared code ownership. And I think I've experienced with the whole scala of things, teams that have their own code and nobody else is allowed to touch it. And maybe I want to point out that there are some disadvantages with working with ownership that is limited to a single team or a single individual. And I see a few disadvantages. Maybe Jurgen, you can add some at the end. So one is you introduce a dependency. It's very clear, and it has all the disadvantages of a dependency. You have wait time and queues and so on. You also have you often introduce a bottleneck. If there are many changes needed in an area where one team is responsible for that code, it suddenly is a bottleneck, and it's something that I experienced very strongly in one of the places where I worked, where there was a platform part and there was an application part, and then the platform team can only touch the platform part, of course, and the application team only make the applications. But then suddenly there's more work in the platform, so they scale up the platform team, but it's still a bottleneck, and the application team is stuck because they are waiting for the platform. But they cannot change it. They know how to change it. They could do it, but they don't do it because it's not their code. Yeah. This type of bottleneck and dependencies on a team.
Yeah, I've been there as well. So if I look at back in 1996, when I started as a software engineer, I was number 12 in the company. Today they would call it a startup. Back in the old days, they didn't. So we each had our own really application. I won't say product, but application. We owned an application, which is generally fun because you get lots of freedom in that application. But if this application becomes the high attention or the focus point to drive business forward, then you become a true bottleneck. I had my own application, my own really invented application in the healthcare domain. It's still running in hospitals today, by the way, even 20 plus years later. So I'm pretty proud about that. The thing is, I become a bottleneck, but then you need to give your baby away. If you start to understand this, it means I need to let go. And I do know this feels very troublesome. And allowing somebody else to touch your baby, ooh.
Yeah, it's very hard. And also often if you're a solo developer, in that case, you're a solo developer, you have the whole application in your head. You have less need to write things down, to have certain types of testing. It's not made to work together on. It's a lot harder for anyone else to get into it.
Yeah, and there you have it. So the risk and the touchy, and it's in my head, but not in somebody else's head. And then you want to control and what today would be called pull request, and you want to really review every small change and blah. You are still a bottleneck.
Yeah,
I soon discovered that for me, having good short feedback cycles in test automation and functional testing as well on that level, that this was the only way out of being a bottleneck, because I felt stressed all over the place. Anyhow, let's continue with your experience.
Yeah, and then maybe a third one, and it's not specifically the bottleneck for the amount of work, but in one team, for example, we had a problem in the platform. Fixing it would have taken us a day, let's say. It was a big frustration for that team, but for the other team, it was a detail. It wasn't really important. So they would maybe fix it in 3 months because they have some very important other work to do. And then you see the amount of frustration this type of thing can cause. You see what you could change. You could easily do it, but you're not allowed to do it. And it's something that is still happening today, often between development and infrastructure then. Not the product itself. It's crazy the amount of frustration and escalations for this type of issues, where if you would allow to make the change, it would probably be a non-problem. So I think
it's a mandate. It's a mandate thing, and it's not a human thing, because if
it's a mandate thing.
If I look at many of the, let's say, technical gurus that I'm connected to, they always come like, okay, you need to look for change dependencies that are happening functional within your architecture, and you need to have this kind of bounded context, and that's where you put a team inside in this context to make sure that we elevate code quality. And they really say, okay, this is the way to elevate code quality and to make sure that people feel attached, engaged, and motivated.
And I think that is true. You need some kind of link between the people and the code that they maintain. But it doesn't exclude some type of shared code ownership. So maybe let's go to a specific example, because it's true that if something is everyone's responsibility and the everyone is very wide, people often don't feel really responsible anymore. And you need really clear guidelines and rules around how to change it. And let me share a few things about an experience I had with the scale of 3-4 squads who all work on the same product, a mobile application, single product owner, one application that is deployed as one thing in the in production. And there we follow it's a shared code ownership that we use, but we also made our architecture in a way so you can work a bit in isolation. So we have functional modules that are really end-to-end. It's the screen, the connection to the backend. Everything is in the single module, and if you have to make something, you typically have to touch only one module if you make a functional change.
So the module is really bounded from start to end.
Yeah, it's vertical. It includes the screens, the domain parts, and the backend communication part. Everything is in this module. Okay. There are a few things that are shared between the modules, but we share as little as possible. There are some UI controls that are shared. Your HTTP client with all its security and cookies is injected in the module, so that part is shared. There are some shared libraries, but for the rest, you have a kind of bounded context, and within this bounded context, you have your own domain model, your own screens, your own backend API implementation, and so on. Meaning, if somebody wants to change something, he has the freedom. And within this context, we have a single backlog for the 3 squads. Every squad get assigned features. And they work on their own features. We typically don't share a feature between teams. We try to avoid it. Sometimes we do it if we have a super urgent feature and we need more capacity than one team, but we try to avoid it so that one module is typically for a while assigned to a single team and they work in this module. If they refactor, they never interfere with somebody else because they're the only one working in that module for a while.
So they're assigned one feature. If you say feature, how do I need to look at feature? So, you know, feature has many things. It's like in the agile world story, which I'm not that much favor of. So it could be small, it could be big. Like if you say feature, let's say how many weeks or days or months.
It depends a little bit.
Team to deliver this or put this feature in production. Let's say the lead time from, okay, this is the feature versus it's in production. What would it be?
Yeah, the fastest features we do take 1 sprint. The slowest ones take 3 months, let's say.
So that's 3 months that people work in isolation where others cannot touch this then.
It's typically in a module where it's, so in this area, it's in the banking area. Imagine that you have to add a new type of payment system. In Belgium, we have this payment system where you scan a QR code.
Yeah.
For example, you have to add this. They will typically make a separate module for a new payment system. And typically none of the other teams will add another payment system at the same time, typically.
Yeah.
So they have the module where the payment system is added, the scanning, this part. Of course, all the other teams are working on other important features. And they touch the same code base, but they will typically not touch that module for that period of time. And if there are bugs to solve, the team that is working on the payment feature will fix them themselves because they are in that area. They for that period of time responsible for that module and everything around it.
So it's all connected to having a decent architecture, which is using the domain models very clearly as a separator.
Yeah, and I wouldn't say that we do it perfectly, but we do it good enough so that the team can work in isolation. We have a few shared domain models and so on. But as soon as we see there is a problem, we isolate them, and it's good enough at this point so that a team typically can work in isolation.
I think my assumption is, Nelis, is that you said banking. So my assumption is that, well, actually, maybe it's a wrong assumption, but anyhow, let's validate with you and your bank. So, but I think in banking, most of the architecture and coding software is really such big time. So now you're talking about having really well-defined and good business domains in the architecture, isolated, so that you can have this way of working you described. Like I imagine that when you started in this banking journey, that it was not the case having this kind of well-structured architecture. So how do you go with having this maybe more or less great architecture towards a more better suited architecture, and how was the interaction, coordination and ownership in between if you go from A to B?
Yeah, so in the beginning, the shared code ownership was not there. Each had their own module that they were responsible for, and nobody else was allowed to touch it. Person A was responsible for this module, person B for this module. I don't know if there is an exact path to get through that. The way I like to work is I like pairing. So I started pairing with one person, and after a while he started to see the value, and then I suggested it would be a good idea to pair with his neighbor. And so one of his friends, but they never paired. Sometimes they solved the problem together. And in this way, it naturally grew that they understood they should not be responsible alone anymore for a module, but at least they started to work to pair. And then in this natural way, we started to define the bounds a little bit differently Papa is bezig. Ik kom straks.
Yeah, the usual COVID interruptions, of course. No problem.
I said he could not disturb me until 11, and it is exactly 11. What was I saying? So we went from pairing, and then we started to mob. We got a chance to start a rewrite for a part of the codes. We started with a very small group who defined the architecture. First with 2 developers, 3 developers, and then from that part, in the beginning, let's say 70% of the time we mobbed until we had the architecture in place with all the proper dependency injection. And then the team started to scale. And that was also our assignment from the beginning. We didn't want to scale, but the organization said, you are going to scale. We have so much backlog for you to do. So make sure you can scale.
How did this go? So because now you say the purpose is to scale and we have so much backlog. And if the people that are looking at the backlog then looked at your endeavors with pairing and mobbing, how did they react? Because to my current experience, if we start doing mobs, I'm in favor of mobs, by the way, myself as well. So, but if we start doing mobs, then people that do not understand coding that very well, they look just at the load and they think like, now we have 8 people working on one machine instead of having 8 people working on their own machines. So they immediately feel like this is not going to be efficient.
In the beginning, I mostly hide. I try to make sure that nobody notices what I'm doing. And in this way, I start to pair with people in a very natural way. I ask their help and I pair a bit. And then after a while, I mean, we start pairing with a few people. And we just explain that we're working together to solve a problem. We don't make it a big thing. It's just what people do. Until you've proven until you pass a certain point where you've proven that you can deliver and you deliver regularly with a good quality, and then you can make it more explicit. Until then, it's just what people do. And sometimes they see you sitting in a meeting room with 3, 4. And if they ask, what are you doing? Then you explain, yeah, we're solving this problem, but you don't make it a big thing.
Yeah.
It's just the thing you do to do your job. It's
a great advice. So cool.
But of course, we didn't have somebody who was like micro-controlling us either. Sometimes if you have a team lead who's against it, it will be hard to do that. He will say, he will make objections. But for us, it was not the case. We had enough trust that they just, some people asked, what are you doing? Are you all the time in meeting?
So the benefits, so if they start doing this here, they don't feel it. And I see in many of the technical books that are being written that only don't stay to the technical, but are also going to organizational parts. That is because of having an identity and having the motivation and engagement getting vaporized if you're not really owning something. Because if it's shared and everybody can at least touch it, you try to avoid it within a single sprint, as you want to call it, in some kind of bounded context that they have freedom in there, but they don't own it. So once it's done, it could go to another team. At least that's a perception I have. So they don't own. So how did you notice and how did they feel motivated and engaged to grow into mobs and letting go?
But what we also do is, so typically we assign every component for support to one of the squads. Once it's developed, some bugs will appear. And typically the squad that made the component is also the one who will solve most of the issues on it.
So there's no ownership in building or creating or adjusting, but there is ownership in production, as I would call it.
There's a partial ownership because we also rotate people between teams. So the original developer will not be there anymore after a few months because they are being rotated around. Every quarter, we change our team composition, not 100%. Sometimes 2 people stay. Sometimes 3 people stay, but developers are rotated to one of the different teams. And in this way, the combination between now they don't mob anymore, not that much. They mostly pair because most of what we do now is executing, meaning we add screens. We don't drastically change the base architecture, but you more follow a certain pattern to add screens. And there's still a lot of improvements being done, but they are mostly done in pairs. And so you pair with somebody from your team. Every sprint, we change the pairs. Every quarter, we change the teams. And in this way, you have a natural dispersion of a way of working between your whole area. So 3 teams.
Yeah. So one of the things that is coming back also in the LinkedIn post that initiated this conversation, by the way, is about the coordination cost. And I see many people talking about coordination cost. Then I do like the more or less approach, which Bas clearly explained as well in this LinkedIn post, it's not co-organization, it's a learning. They are learning across a multitude. This is what I think you're bringing back as well. So because of this pairing and changing pairs and also moving team members away, but not having code ownership that explicit as well, you get more of shared learning happening, which you naturally grow alignment. Is that the case, or?
Yeah, indeed. We also have explicit learning moments. For now, we have 2 in every sprint. We have one, we call it a mob session, where we share our learnings. Imagine that you learned a new way to set up a view model in Android. Somebody learned that in the sprint, and he wants everyone to know that because it's a better way than we used before. You reserve a spot in the sharing session or in the mob session, and there you show it to all the rest. We have a brief discussion. Often we take a small decision. Okay, from now on we follow this new approach, and we do it. We also have we use not a lot, but we use architectural decision records. I don't know if you know that. It's a specific way to document more complex architectural decision. For example, if you want to switch from Java to Kotlin, or you want to change your packet structure, or to put it more functional instead of the technical layers, it's a more complex decision where not everyone immediately agrees. You cannot discuss it in 10 minutes. Then we gather advantages, disadvantages, and as a group, then we take a decision, we document it there in that record, and we move on. And we also have an innovation afternoon. It's one afternoon where it's something very recent, where we just, you can come up with any topic. So it doesn't have to be on the current backlog, any type of improvement, and you can just execute it in that afternoon. And we typically do it in mobs. So we have a few rooms in a Zoom session. Yeah. We start with the first 10 minutes to state, I'm going to do this, I'm going to do this, I'm going to do this. And I'm going to do it in room 3. It's more like a bit like open space ID. Everyone puts something on the calendar and they work for it on the afternoon. For example, we made a notifier for Zoom if our build fails in this afternoon. It has nothing to do with our product, but still it's a kind of innovation that is related, and
nice stuff.
In it and,
so if you know, like we started with Conways Law and code ownership, like in a couple of sentences or a couple of words, what would be your preferred setup? And is there indeed a hard link between the organizational structure and code ownership in that sense? Because that's what Conways Law is bringing us. The architecture is the organization. So what is your preferred way, looking back at the experience you have shared?
And I think the Conways Laws is pretty strong. I mean, it's there. It's not so easy to go against it. And I think, so with my example, I showed it can work for an area where you have a shared backlog, a clear shared goal, and a set of people. In my case, it's 3 squads. It's slowly, we have an Android and an iOS app, and they are merging slowly, so it will scale to 5 squads. But I think, imagine that it's hundreds of people, it might be a lot harder to scale that same system, because your sharing sessions, I don't know how you will organize it. So I think Conways Law locally with a shared product backlog, you can probably get around it and say we have shared code ownership. But I don't know if you can scale it to 100 of people. Then you might have to use the pull request type of model or something like that to be able to scale it, like they do in open source.
I do like the thought pattern, and the thing is for me as well is like you say, okay, Conways Law is there. It's a physics law. Let's put it like this. But you can swim against it. It's not easy, but you can. And there are opportunities if you share the same backlog, the same goal set forward, and then you need to find other ways. Or like the Agile Manifesto was saying, we uncover better ways by doing and helping others do it. So this is what we at least need to try, because there are some bigger benefits, as you have explained in your examples as well. Nelis, so before we really close it down for this recording, at least, so I know you are very much into architecture, and we have been discussing architecture. I learned architectural katas from your mind and from your endeavors in the Socrates community here in Belgium. So how do you feel about scheduling another call sometime somewhere and discuss more on the architecture that would allow shared code ownership, for example, or different deploys, and let's maybe also debunk a couple of the misconceptions related to microservices, which are so hot here in banking. So, and also what is now a platform, maybe, because for me, a platform is a business model. It's not something technical. So if I look at platforms, it's about one-sided, two-sided business models, but many of the banks think about platform more as a coding or architectural practice. So maybe this would be interesting in the next conversation. What do you think?
Yeah, I think it's a good idea. I could prepare it a little bit and explain, for example, the architecture we now follow. I think it's very contextual. It's not so easy to make a general architecture that works everywhere.
Yeah.
But I think it's very important to try and decouple that you can make something, build a feature within your team without having to coordinate with other teams end to end. And together with the shared code ownership in some kind of way. So that's your goal for scaling. And then you can scale it in some kind of way. So
you mentioned something, I think before we recorded anything and in the past, is that this kind of isolation of being able to do something is more related to having the freedom to do structural changes in the architecture, correct?
Correct, yeah.
Yeah. So this might be linked as well in the next call. So let's schedule something afterwards and see if we can bring you back to the audience here. So for now, let's have a wave to the people watching this thing. So see you back again. Bye bye.
Yeah, see you back. Thank you. Bye bye.